Do you really need to use expensive screws like this, or are cheaper drywall screws more than adequate? And does pre-drilling actually make your screws weaker? In this video, we will be testing all of those with some surprising results that frankly makes me eat my own words, and it'll probably change the way you use screws. First up, shear strength. Now, how many times have you seen a YouTuber sink a screw, use a hammer to snap it, and call it strong or weak based on their feelings? Look, experience combined with having a feel for something is an incredibly valuable asset, but I think we can do a little bit better than that. So I took a bench vise, started drilling a hole to nestle the screws in the same spot for this test, but the bit snapped. So I did the only rational thing of using the vise for its own demise. We can then mount the vise into this makeshift hydraulic press with a fixture plate and then attach our first screw, starting with the cheapest drywall screw that costs $2.50 for 100. And this is how they crumble. Let's watch that again in slow motion because we happen to have a Kronos high-speed camera in the shop and it's just fun to see things in slow motion. Okay, so with 6 samples, we get an average shear strength of 975.3 pounds. All of the forces in these tests were designed to be concentrated near the junction between the shaft and the head of the screw. And to me, 975 pounds seems like a lot for a single humble drywall screw. But how does that compare against a general construction screw that pretty much has the same geometry, thread pitch, and bugle head, and costs $3.80 per 100? And on average, we get 527.67 pounds. So this is a screw that costs 52% more than a drywall screw and is 54% weaker. Now, the third screw on our list is a much higher priced GRK brand that costs $9 per 100. And if you're keeping track, that's nearly 4 times more expensive than a drywall screw. And if we mount it on a vise and snap, wait a minute, that's not snapping at all. The groove on this vise is pretty much the exact same size and we're using the same number 6 size screws of the same length, yet these screws are bending more than they are snapping, sort of like a nail. But more on that later. But if we move the screws over to the vise and get a nicer and stronger grip on it, we can force the shaft to snap. Now, interestingly, the braking or the pulling forces in both cases, because we did 2 sets of tests here, just to be sure, the results were virtually the same. And to my surprise, it only took 319.16 pounds to break. The most expensive screw in this lineup is 3 times weaker than the cheapest screw we have. And to me, that is absolutely wild. Now, I don't know about you guys, but how often do you sink a screw most of the way and then snap it on your projects? Probably never. So even though this test gives us a really good direct comparison of the raw material strength of these different types of screws, we do need to sink them in some wood to do some real world application testing. Starting with some cherry as our representative hardwood, the drywall screw takes 391 pounds of shear strength, and in all of these cases, the heads snapped right off. The construction screw took 382 pounds. And again, the same situation, the heads all snapped right off. Now the GRK screws, on the other hand, in every instance, the screw bent and the heads never snapped off. And it took an average of 309 pounds to pull them out from shear force. When we do the same sets of tests in softwood, it's no surprise that the squishy fibers of a 2x4 gives out much more easily. Now, looking at the big picture, when it comes to shear strength, both the cheap drywall screw and the moderately priced construction screw absolutely outperforms the more expensive GRK screws hands down. Now, screws are most commonly used in the horizontal position than a vertical mount. So what I mean by that is you're more likely to use screws to fix stuff against a wall, like the wall behind me, or cabinets, or whatever have you, than to fix something against a ceiling where you're doing a vertical load. But in reality though, a screw is usually subjected to a combination of both horizontal shear forces and vertical tension. So it is important for us to test out the pull-out strength of these drastically different priced screws to see how they compare. And for that, we need to make a new jig by cutting some steel, squaring it up, drilling some holes, firing up my newly acquired TIG welder, and pretending to be cooler than I actually am, because I don't know how to really TIG weld, and so let's hope this joint is stronger than the screws. Starting with some cherry hardwood, I'm sinking the drywall screws straight down without pre-drilling like all of the other tests we've done so far. But don't you worry, pre-drilling test results are coming up where I will pretty much have to eat my words more than once. But for now, the drywall screw took an average of 397 pounds to pull out. The construction screw took an average of 424 pounds to pull out. And interestingly, the GRK screws took just 287.5 pounds to pull out. Now, the GRK screws do not have threads on the entire shaft as the other two screws, but it does have finer threads, which is supposed to be the more preferred and stronger option for hardwoods. Yet, it is significantly weaker than the two cheaper alternatives. Moving on to softwoods, the drywall screws took an average of 256.8 pounds. Construction screws took 219.8 pounds, and get this, GRK screws took just 110.8 pounds. This is not looking good for the GRK screws. And by the way, I should say that in all of my tests, I tried to use wood from the same boards, being very mindful of grain orientation. And then in the case of the 2x4s, I used similar looking boards from the same pile from the home center. Even so, I could not believe just how much weaker these GRK screws were. So I increased the sample size in my tests for the softwood from 6 to 12, and then mixed up the pieces of wood to try to get as much of an accurate and averaged out results as I could, but the numbers simply did not change. These specific GRK screws are simply that much weaker on tensile strength. So much so that I thought I could pull these out by hand. Little awkward space, but let's see. Okay. And no, no matter how much you wish it was true, I am not the brown Hulk. And I personally absolutely love doing tests like this because it's the only way we can get some hard numbers with some direct comparisons. And if you're into this type of content, it would absolutely mean the world to me if you subscribe to the channel and perhaps provide some suggestions on what I should test next. And thank you for supporting this channel. Now, from a value perspective, drywall screws are an absolute clear winner. They perform shoulder to shoulder on the slightly more expensive construction screws, yet are significantly cheaper. The GRK screws, on the other hand, is the loser in strength and value. However, unlike the drywall and the construction screw that kind of fail all at once like a catastrophic failure, these GRK screws are more bendy and more forgiving in a dynamic load situation like a traditional nail. Now, this wouldn't be much of a video on screws if we didn't talk about pre-drilling. Common wisdom and experience suggest that you should almost always pre-drill a pilot hole so that the wood has some space to accommodate the new screw and prevent splitting the wood or snapping the screw head. Now, I'm not here to argue whether or not you need to pre-drill because I'm not in the business of telling you that water is wet. But I will say this, on the hundreds of screws that I've driven on this video without a pilot hole, I've just had 2 screw heads snap and 0 wood splits. But these are short screws on wide pieces of wood. Anytime you're driving longer screws, especially on narrower materials or close to the edge of a material, pre-drilling will minimize you from having a bad day. But I have a theory. I think pre-drilling an undersized pilot hole makes it stronger. Let me explain. So when it comes to figuring out the pilot hole size for a screw, most people would take a caliper on the minor diameter of a screw and then drill a pilot hole to that size. This way, the thread of the screws get full engagement within the wood without the shaft causing unnecessary friction that you can see here. However, as we tested, these screws are plenty strong, and if we undersize the hole and drive the screw, it would cause the wood fibers to get hardened through compression that you can see here. And it'll make the screw holding power stronger. So for this test, we'll be using the same number 6 construction screw from earlier in the video with a minor diameter of 0.9 inches. We will be testing no pilot hole, exact size pilot hole of the minor diameter, and a undersized hole of 0.076 inches. And this hypothesis, by the way, is mostly relevant for the pullout strength. However, for the sake of science, I've gone through the labor of doing all of the shear strength tests as well. And here are the results for hardwoods. There is virtually no difference in shear strength between any of the pilot hole sizes from no pilot hole on the left, pilot hole of the exact size of the minor diameter of the screw in the middle, and undersized pilot hole on the right. Now, for softwood, everything is a little bit weaker compared against the hardwoods, but the exact size pilot hole does come out a little bit stronger for some reason that I personally don't understand. If you have any thoughts on this, please leave a comment down below. Now, let's get to the good stuff. On hardwoods, it took an average of 424.2 pounds to pull the screws without any pilot holes. With an exact size pilot hole, it took 396.2 pounds. So virtually no difference between raw dogging the hardwood with the screw versus a properly fitted pilot hole. And if you remember my theory on undersizing the pilot hole being stronger, it is somehow slightly weaker at 369 pounds. And when we do the same sets of tests on softwood, the results are equally confusing because the undersized hole does come out a little bit stronger, but somehow the no pilot hole comes out weaker. In this case, the hypothesis that I had is absolutely wrong, but that's not necessarily a bad thing, because what it actually means is that the difference in strength between like no pilot hole, exact same size pilot hole, or even an undersized pilot hole are pretty much insignificant, at least in these limited tests. So drill to your heart's content and sink those spectacular drywall screws as you please. But remember, experience still suggests that you should probably pre-drill when using longer screws on narrow or close to the edge of a material. Thank you for watching. I will see you on the next one.